I'm going to hand this microphone off to Genevieve, who's then going to help introduce the rest of the panel, so that way I'm not introducing them. But it's also a great honor to have these three humans here on stage to have a very insightful and interesting conversation about the future of New York City.
Thank you, Noel. Hey, folks. I'm glad everyone's feeling good, that you made it to the end of the day. So does everyone know what occasion we are celebrating today or this week? What is our collective anniversary? Anybody?
5 years.
Yes, 5 years of New York City's open data law, which represents an incredible moment for us to reflect as a community, as we've done all day, looking at the incredible projects that people have launched and are demonstrating impact against in putting together open standards, empowering our communities, and creating tools to secure a more safer, more dignified New York. Recently, the Mozilla Foundation released their prototyped Internet Health Report, which takes a lot of those principles and talks about them in the context of the internet ecosystem that we are currently in. So how open is it to everyone to innovate online? How are we doing in terms of opening up access, being really inclusive, and ensuring that everyone can have a secure experience online? So for this closing discussion, I'd love to ask these two incredible folks that we have with us about what comes next for us as a community, what all of these things really mean in the context of the lived experience of New Yorkers, and what we should be doing as a community to build more demand for a healthy, open internet ecosystem. So the two folks we have with us today, we're incredibly lucky. We have Miguel Gamiño, CTO of New York City, whose role in the city is to coordinate agencies around what it means to be a smart city. What are we doing to prepare for the Internet of Things and implement it in our city in a really great way? And Miguel has also been an incredible thought leader around what it means to bring broadband into communities and is spearheading the mayor's efforts to bring broadband to every citizen and small business by 2025. With Miguel, we have Greta Byrum, Director of Community Resilience at NewAmerica, where she is reimagining what it means to manage and build local systems in a way that supports residents in their roles as leaders in their communities and preparedness experts. Greta's work has focused on building flexible communications infrastructure so that folks can really respond in the event of an emergency and get all of the resources that they need. Have I described you guys well? Is there anything you would add to that?
I'm also a human.
You also a human? Okay.
That's funny because I was going to say I'm a cyborg.
Oh, good. Well, then we've got all views represented here today. So many of our panels and workshops today have looked at all the different projects we have, and we're in this incredible moment where we have a lot of work to show off. We've got public officials who get it, right? And we can show impact in how we're improving the lives of New Yorkers. So my first question to you is, what do you see as the next step, the next phase of this community in New York? Miguel?
Me first?
Yeah.
I think that this is going to be a very broad answer to get started with, but I think we need to recognize that we're at the very beginning of something, right? So 5 years may feel like a long time, but in the space of what is likely to occur, we're just at the very beginning. So I think it's really interesting to see people continuing to come together. I think for me personally, and having worked in organizations now for several years that have just about every kind of area of focus in terms of industry and skill sets, being a city government. So you can't take for granted, I'm not in an organization that is by default technological. And I think what I've seen very recently is the data conversation and the technology conversation more broadly is occurring at maybe unexpected places. So people are now equating this to a really useful, valuable tool to them in the future of how they're doing their work in traditionally non-technical kind of areas of focus. So that's a long way of saying it's really cool to see people who never would have been associated with the data conversation, not only talking about it, but trying really hard to figure out how to bring it to bear to solve non-technical, non-data, traditional, important problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's that people are more and more aware of their data profile. They're more aware of what happens to your data, how it's used. People are more and more aware that we're generating data all the time, that it can be useful in certain ways, and that there are also risks attached in other ways. And I think people are also becoming more aware. There's more of a conversation about equity. Digital equity. So what does that really mean in the city? And I think people are thinking about it in a lot of different productive, there's really a variety of ways that people are approaching this. A lot of it has to do with efforts to, increase knowledge and awareness. A lot of it has to do with physical planning. So I think there's like sort of a dawning awareness that, whereas we wouldn't be okay with people having unequal water systems or energy systems, that there has been inequity in the way that our digital infrastructure has been built. And people are starting to address that. We see that there's a technical element in the 4th regional plan of the Regional Plan Association for the first time ever. So people are understanding digital access as a physical question as well as a fundamental question of equity, access, and freedom of speech. So I think it's a really exciting time, and we're really, like you said, Miguel, we're at the beginning of something, and I'm excited to see what happens.
I think also what you were describing in a lot of ways is evidence of what I was describing, because it's a mainstream conversation, right? So it's now seen as a fundamental need for the future of opportunity and prosperity and equity and all these sorts of things that have always been kind of societal concerns. They're just, I think, now becoming technological conversations about the same concerns we've had for ever, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you guys bring up the equity piece, because my next question is, over the last couple of months, we've seen that many of the principles that we were just talking about, openness, inclusion, making sure that power isn't so consolidated or used in a bad way, those principles are being threatened by the federal administration in a number of ways, from bullying our immigrant neighbors to transgendered students, even women or undocumented folks. Given that all of this is happening, how does that change what the city can do and what the community should be doing to protect those principles? How do you see that responsibility shifting?
Yeah, so I think that folks in this room, anybody who works with data is aware that, data in itself, it isn't good or bad. In itself, data is just data. But how that data gets used, the ethics and the principles that we apply to that has a huge impact. And I think right now, whereas we are seeing a huge expansion and uptake, we still have some way to go in connecting folks and creating that kind of equity of access, that we also really need to think about the way that data is used. And I think there's two major ways that we should be thinking about it. One is in terms of increasing everybody's knowledge about data, both the good and the bad, how you're tracked, but also how you could collect and use data for advocacy and to increase equity in certain ways. The other area where I think we need to really focus is the city side and being really thoughtful, and I see this happening in New York City, being thoughtful about some of the populations that are more at risk in this political environment, and thinking about, for example, what kinds of data should be collected, what kinds of policies should we have around retention of data, what kinds of data should we open, what kinds of policies should we have in place in terms of protecting people's identities if we do open data. And I think, a lot of cities are grappling with these kinds of issues, and I think New York is at the front of, starting to really grapple with it. It's a deep and difficult issue, but I think, I'd love to hear about some of the things that you guys are thinking about in that area.
Well, I think, certainly we need to be paying very close attention to how data can be used, and I think be prepared to be responsive to when it gets used in ways we're not expecting. I guess that's one way of saying I don't think we can anticipate every nefarious use case, but I do think we have to be paying close attention to it so we can respond to it if and when it happens. And I don't mean that from the city's perspective, meaning the city's going to do anything nefarious, but I think the city has a role in paying attention. So do the members of the public. So does the commercial players in the conversation. I think everybody needs to pay attention for the same reason I described when we started. Was we're at the beginning of something, right? So there's a lot of things that are still unknown, but I think we have to. It's certainly where things are headed, and we have to pay close attention to it and make sure we're being wise with how we use it. I think generally, I'll say that I think I'm probably going to misquote this, but I think there was a saying that sunlight was the ultimate antiseptic or disinfectant, and I think data is the digital sunlight. So I think it really can bring some truth to conversations that need it. But we have to be paying close attention. I mean, we're in some uncharted territory in some regards, in a lot of regards. So we have to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add, in addition to, the city's responsibility, and you mentioned the private sector, I think there's also, the public sector, both in terms of philanthropy and also nonprofit organizations that work with some of these at-risk populations. A lot of these orgs are struggling just every day to do what their mission says that they do. They're under-resourced, they're doing really important work in communities, and it's hard for those kinds of organizations to necessarily know how to even protect data. And so I think the more that we can kind of connect the dots among all the sectors and kind of say, like, okay, here's a place where we need to pay attention. Some of this data is floating around out there, and we need to make sure that it's not being used for, by bad actors. And I'll just mention, we do work with the city, with the Economic Development Corporation. We work with nonprofit organizations in 6 Sandy impacted communities. We're building mesh networks in partnership with those organizations. And one of the things we're trying to do is work with the communities to develop data policies with them so they understand what kind of data can be collected, what kind of data they want to collect. They're making, deliberate decisions about what they're going to collect, how they're going to manage it, who's going to own it, and what's going to be done with it. And so at the end of that process, we're hoping that folks in communities, in addition to the community organizations that serve them, will be more aware of all the potential, benefits and harms that can come from using Wi-Fi, for example.
Yeah, I think you touched towards a couple times about on a topic that I think needs to be discussed here and just at large, which is that awareness. Like, do these disadvantaged or otherwise less aware communities, how do we close that gap, right? And that's the literacy component's not just about access to technology and what it can do for your kind of your life of opportunity, but also when you engage with it, knowingly or unknowingly, what's being left behind and what is at risk. And the truth is that I guess I am something of a informed person on the topic, and I don't even always completely, even if I know, I might not be consciously thinking about the digital footprint I'm leaving behind. And so if I'm in that situation, I can imagine lots of other populations that don't have nearly as much awareness and education and literacy in that space. So I say all that to say, even people not doing anything nefarious, but people not fully acknowledging how they are engaging with those things that companies or other people are doing, that by itself is an issue that I think we have to figure out how to address.
Yeah, and to wrap up that question, I just wanted to give shouts out to some of the folks in this room that are doing great work in this area. So, the libraries are all doing amazing work, helping people understand what it means to interact online. City Council, I can't remember the name of the tool. Is it Councilmatic? That was demoed here. That's an awesome tool. So I see a lot of folks in this room doing great work, open referrals. All of you guys are really doing awesome work to sort of open up the black box of data and, make it something that everybody has a say over and has some self-determination with. So good job.
Yeah. I wonder if you could put that, Greta, in a little more context for us. How does someone's actual lived experience change once you've opened that up and once you've built up that literacy and awareness?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I think the struggle is opening up awareness without freaking people out. Because I think it's pretty easy for us to go over to the dark side, especially these days, looking at tracking and profiling and discrimination and algorithms and fake news. I mean, there's a lot of bad news out there in data land. So I think anything we can do to get people hands-on, and that's the way that we tend to work in communities, is to get people to actually build stuff. And, we find a lot of times, if you go to folks in a community and you say okay, we're gonna make a node and we're gonna use the Raspberry Pi and a router to just make a little hotspot, people are afraid they're gonna break it oftentimes. And that was my feeling the first, I'm gonna break everything. And so just getting people hands-on so that it's not scary and it doesn't seem mysterious, and people start feeling okay, I have a little bit of a say and I can dive a little bit deeper, and then it's not sort of just me as an individual kind of encountering this whole world of possible bad actors and scary things that could happen, but rather I'm there with my community thinking about how we could use this stuff to help us face challenges that are already present, and also to potentially do really cool stuff. So I think that's where some of the leadership in this room is really important, is in helping people see possible ways to use data for good.
Great, thank you. So sort of thinking about the other end of that system, we've been really good as a community, I think, in designing and creating tools that folks actually need and are going to use if we can get them out to the communities. But what about the other side of that? What role do you see the city playing in helping those things to scale? How do we create an environment where the tools that we're making don't just become sort of one-off or don't kind of die off if they don't get another grant of funding or something like that? What can we be doing to make that ecosystem healthier?
I think it starts with the way that you engage in the first place. Meaning, I think from the onset, you have to consider that sustainability angle. It's been one of my concerns about kind of the hyper focus on the hackathon approach to helping solve problems, because what I observed was some really great people came in, they helped, they came, they saw, they helped, they left. And the city employees or agency employees or even nonprofit employees, like those agencies that were benefited and affected may not have been fully equipped to carry the ball forward.
Yeah.
And so in my experiences, we started to change a little bit to pivot on that and be more concerned with how this thing carries forward afterwards, and factoring in the fact that we needed to be doing either skills retraining or identifying, the sustainability component of the funding, or all of those sorts of things up front, so that if they come and they see and they help fix with great tools and talent, that we can continue that. Sometimes that turns into businesses, and those businesses then help perpetuate that going forward, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they were never intended to be. So I think, I don't know if that's a groundbreaking response to that question, but I think it really has to be thoughtfully considered in the beginning.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then your likelihood of sustaining or succeeding after the finish line, I think, increase significantly. So sometimes that's in residence programs, sometimes that's thinking about the financing model, like I said, but doing as much of that stuff collectively and upfront as possible.
Yeah, and I think the city's been doing really interesting work in those areas, especially if we look at, sort of the way that the city's been handling tools like franchising. So really being thoughtful about, not only like who are we going to create an agreement with for example, like the rollout of Wi-Fi in public housing, but how are we going to build those franchise agreements so that those projects are sustainable? What kinds of partnerships do we want to see? And I think part of that is, involving multiple sectors again, and not just thinking of these as grant supported or, supported by government, but actually thinking about, well, how do we build in community involvement in these, and how do we bring in other sectors to really think through sustainability? I think there's so much energy and excitement around things like the platform cooperativism movement, and that's something that we can kind of link to some of the city initiatives that are going on. That's something that we're working on, is saying, okay, let's take these 6 networks that are supported by EDC in the startup phase, and then in the long term, think about building them as cooperatives and thinking of them as community initiatives that are owned and run by the communities themselves. So I think, really creative partnerships is a huge way that the city does that, as well as, building in community benefits into franchise agreements whenever the city is purchasing services.
I think that also comes from acknowledging that these aren't, we're moving past the time period of thinking that these might work or these might be valuable. We're beyond the piloting and experimentation phase, where not a lot of thought was given to the sustainability side because we weren't sure that they'd even live that long. And now that we're seeing that this stuff really does have value and is critical to sometimes the survival of a particular mission, I think now a different frame of mind is at the table earlier in the process. So I think it's getting better and better and better, partially just from the natural evolution of how we see this in the context of valuable methods and tools to accomplish the goal.
Yeah, and not just on the city's part, but I think everybody who lives, New Yorkers are amazingly involved and engaged, and the more that New Yorkers make it possible for the city to do good things because there's public energy around it, the better. So I think there's a great symbiosis between the civic sector and especially the civic tech sector and the government, and it's great that you guys are listening. So
that is the perfect intro to the last part of this talk. So I don't know if you guys know about sort of the origin story of New York City's open data law, but it is this incredible case study in how, as a community, we can act as advocates to ask for a really big change and actually create a political air cover for the city to do it, right? So building that demand and saying, we need standards around open data in conjunction with working with folks in the city led to the creation of this law. And, as we've seen, there are all these projects that we're doing inside and outside of government to make more seats at the table and to really open up who can engage with these topics, whose perspective is considered, and who can advocate for smart practices in these in our communities, right? And so my first question around that is, how do you build that kind of demand in a community that has traditionally been disempowered? You know, how do you get people to understand what they need to ask for?
I think you have to tell the story in a way that makes it clear why it matters to them. Like, I think, you know, for a long time, it's been rooms of people that are, it's a little bit of an echo chamber because they're techies talking about tech, or they're civic kind of wonks talking about policy, and then those two groups started to get together and started talking about how tech could improve civic, so I think it's a natural evolution. So I'm not critical of it. I'm saying the next phase, I think, or the next wave that's important to address the question you asked, is getting everyone else involved. And the way you get everyone else involved is they have to understand why it matters to them. They don't. Some people don't particularly care about technology for technology's sake. In fact, most people probably don't care about technology for technology's sake. Yeah. They want to know, why does this matter to me? And so here are my 5 struggles every day. How does this move that needle? Yeah. And if it does, and which I'm sitting up here because I believe it does, but when that resonates with them, then you've mobilized average people or everyone else or whatever, however you want to kind of categorize it. That, I think, brings the conversation to the mainstream, and then that's when you start getting, you know, a different kind of attention to it. Mm-hmm. And when I was in San Francisco, that was one of the things I was asked when I moved here, what was my accomplishment? And they thought my answer was going to be some project that we did or some law that we passed or some like very specific thing. And I told the honest to God truth was, I was part of a small group of people that got broadband on the cover of the Chronicle. That was it. That was a big accomplishment. They're like, what? Because the conversation had entered the mainstream. Mm-hmm. That's mainstream media on like all of a sudden broadband is cover worthy in a traditional conversation, like in a mainstream conversation. That was evidence to me that the ship was turning. And so I think that is the key, is to get the story crafted right, and the truth be there in a way that makes it compelling and understandable and relatable and ultimately valuable to the people not in this room, but to everybody else.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to pull out something that you said in terms of that, you know, people really need to understand technology and data not as, you know, a goal unto itself, like, oh, we need more technology or we need more broadband, but rather a means to an end. And that's when it really becomes meaningful to folks. So, you know, like to someone who is working 2 jobs and has kids and, you know, is facing a lot of clear and present issues, you know, how am I going to afford healthcare? How am I going to, you know, lots of stresses. If technology is a means to other kinds of goals, we're going to get a lot further with building the right kinds of technology because people will be more involved. And so I want to add another term into the mix. Like, we talk a lot about civic technology, and one thing I like to talk about is community technology, which is a little bit different because it's not just about our relationship with the government. It's not just about how I, as an individual, interact with my government. It's about how communities come online and how communities share technology tools in order to pursue goals and face challenges that they are already engaged with. And so I think that's one way that the city and other players can kind of act in a way to enrich the ecosystem, is to you know, really understand both like what are the local challenges in communities, what are the local assets in communities? Who can we actually support who's already doing good work? How can we provide the tools of technology and actually root those tools in the community so it's not, somebody coming from outside and saying, let me tell you about data, but rather people in communities have an understanding of what data they're producing and using and how they could use it, for example, to tell stories, which I think, ultimately storytelling is going to be what gets people the most engaged.
Wonderful. And so what do you think that means for us as a community then? Should we be trying to get more of these conversations into the mainstream? It seems like we have an incredible opportunity before us in that more attention than ever is given to, civic engagement and how we interact with the government, a number of levels, or is it advocating for very particular standards, or what do you think that we should be doing kind of as a collective here in New York?
Well, I think this is another overused term, but I think being human-centered or user-centered about the way products are getting designed, solutions are getting designed is super important. Again, I can't say it enough. It's at the end of the day, it's got to matter to the person, to the target audience, right? Mm-hmm. And so the government is not the only entity guilty of solving what we think is a problem, mm-hmm. the way that we think is best. And so again, engaging with that community and understanding if you're a startup, working on a civic tech or community tech type thing, making sure that you don't just project what you think the community wants, but actually asking them does two things. It makes the outcome better, but it also gets them more aware and more involved. And it becomes more of a mainstream conversation. And I think I know that lots of people are doing that in the country. I think we just need to do more and more of that. I think that serves many purposes.
Yeah, I mean, and the things you said, I think all of the above, let's do all of it. I think it's the same question that happens with regard to, what do we do about this crazy administration? We do all of it. And I think, everybody contributes what they can and what they're passionate about. And so I think, some people are going to fight the state muni broadband bans. And some people are going to work with the city council to make their information more available. And some people are going to work directly with communities and, teach them how to use data. I think we need all of it, and we need to be passionate about it and, share some common goals, but do what you're good at and what you enjoy. And that's the best way it's going to happen. I mean, for me, it's physical planning. So I feel the Mozilla report is great in that it really opens up the 5 areas that it talks about. It is 5, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I did read it, but all of that stuff is super important. What it doesn't do is it doesn't actually talk to you about the physical infrastructure of the internet, which is something I'm really fascinated by. There's fiber, there's wireless, there are data centers. All of this stuff makes the internet. It's a network of networks. It's a complicated, awesome, kind of interesting infrastructure. And people, they may know about the web, but they don't necessarily know about the physical part of planning. And so I get really excited about going into communities and saying, you can build your own. And this is a line of sight, and these are routers, and you can have your own last mile infrastructure. And then I think people are more aware, and they can, say to the city, hey, via their city council member, they could say, hey, we really want more fiber over here in Far Rockaway. You guys are already, tearing up the streets to do this other thing. Why don't you put fiber in here too? People have to understand what the internet is physically in order to ask the city for that. So that's where I feel my contribution is in that area. But all of you have contributions. It's just what your passion is.
Do you have any success stories you can share with us about community actually going and asking for something like that?
That Far Rockaway example is real. But it's, the community there's a DOT project alongside of an EDC project to revitalize the downtown of Far Rockaway. And, our community partner there, which is the Rockaway Development and Revitalization Corporation, they want to go to the city and say, hey, as long as you're going to tear up the streets here, let's have really great fiber, and then that will help with the backhaul or the data for the last mile network that we're building in Far Rockaway. So I'm actually not sure what the present status of that is, but it is a conversation that was initiated because this local neighborhood group had an awareness that this was an opportunity, which I don't think they would have had if we hadn't been, already working with them on the last mile project.
That's great. So I think we actually have a few more minutes left. Would you guys be open to answering any questions that the audience might have? Could we do that? Any questions?
Sure. I'm going to have to see one of these mics.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's got them? We got 12 minutes. No, we have 8 minutes left. Oh, 7 minutes now. Right over here.
Jolly, do we have to repeat the question?
No, not if he asked it.
Oh, great.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. What's San Francisco doing or has already done that New York needs to?
The loaded question. I get asked the question a lot to compare San Francisco and New York, and it took me a while to kind of get my head around that. It's like your two children. You love them both for different reasons, but the one that loves you back right now, it has a little special place. No, I'm kidding. No. So I also joke that I was blessed to be the CIO of the greatest city on the West Coast, and now I'm blessed to be the CTO of the greatest city, period. So I think what I have found that is very interesting about New York is its social consciousness. So I may not be answering your question directly, but I'm going to tell you what my assessment is. That I think in New York there is a very interesting culture of it's okay to do well, but it's even better if you do good along the way. And I think that has been fascinating to me. I think there's lots of people in cities all over the country that feel that way, and you come here and you find yourself surrounded by more other people that feel that way than maybe anywhere. And so it's been really exciting to me. I think that New York has a tremendous amount of inertia and momentum. I think from my own role, frankly, the conversations I had that compelled me to move here were that the administration, the city, people that are in my office and in other agencies are all amazingly interested in moving this tech needle forward and have a really good understanding of how it impacts that actual valuable use case, the actual end user. So it's not just let's do tech for tech, let's do tech for good reasons that matter to everyday people. So that's my I've been here for 90 days or so. So that's my 90-day assessment so far. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, even when it is ridiculously cold compared to San Francisco. But it's an amazing place at an amazing time. I think particularly, I'll encroach a little bit on a interesting part of a conversation, which I think, given what's happening at the federal level, it's more important now than ever for people to mobilize and activate locally. And I don't just mean that in like a physical way. I mean actually doing good work, making good progress, and tech is a major weapon for that. And New York just has all of those things all wrapped up. And I think there's going to be some great things that happen here.
Before we flood.
What's that?
All right.
Before we flood.
Before,
So there are two things you said, Miguel. If and when we'll make sure we respond. So in terms of like things being used in not a good way. So, okay, we have to be ready to respond. And my thing is like, how do we respect life in all its forms? And then who controls the story? You talk about the story, and I heard someone up there say, we have to make people understand what to ask for. Who's controlling the story, and how are you respecting every single life that is harmed in your response to technology?
I think that I think it's complicated times. I think that there's lots of groups that are paying attention to lots of interests, and the more and more that they are engaged in the technology conversation, then the better chance we have at making sure all those different voices are heard. So I think it's frankly a distributed ecosystem that is engaged. It's not, I hope they get engaged. It's a distributed ecosystem of organizations and community people that are actively engaged, involved, and paying attention to a lot of that. And that is I think maybe the best way to make sure all those voices are heard and addressed.
Yeah, I would just add, in our work, what we're really doing, I mean, the end goal of the networks we're building, yeah, they're mesh networks and people can access the internet with them, but we're building them in sandy impacted communities that are low-lying, that are going to be flooded, speaking of flooding, Noel. And so, we're building these networks to be resilient. They've got 2 sources of backhaul, there's self-healing mesh, there's lots of design features that are about resilience, but the purpose of this is not just to sort of put tech into these communities, but also to make that tech a resource for folks there. So they're going to be there in the case of emergencies. They will hopefully keep running if the internet fails, if cell phone networks fail. But also people in the day-to-day are starting to say, okay, how do we use these for the other things that are happening in our communities? Okay, we could put sensors on these networks that would help us keep track of air quality. So in Hunts Point, that's something they're really concerned about. Their kids have asthma. They are using them in certain places to say, okay, how many times are our kids getting stopped by the police? Let's gather some data ourselves on that. So local communities, they know what's going on for them. They know what their issues are. I think what I heard Miguel said, and what I totally agree with, is actually we need to be listening, and tech is one way that we can create ways for communities to talk back. So I think that's our best hope in terms of sea level rise, in terms of a lot of other community issues. So I think it's about, let's make sure people are informed about potential harms, but also let's place tech and root it and really make it part of local communities, as you said, a distributed ecosystem, so that it's really surfacing what's happening in those communities already and really supporting existing social support networks.
All right, how many more questions are there? Okay, well then we will end on time. So thank you, Greta. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Genevieve.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, volunteers who came out and gave labor and capital to make this event a great day. Thank you, Solidarity ticket holders, general ticket holders, everybody paying a little bit. And thank you, sponsors and Rise for making this event happen. I know that for the small leadership team that has sweated bullets the last 7 weeks, we're going to have we're going to enjoy ourselves a few blocks away, and there's going to be a merry band of fiddlers taking you that way. Lexi, who's leading that challenge? So there's going to be Lauren, who the birthday person, human. She will be guiding you with someone who joined us late into the game, Christian, with a beautiful set of hair. And they will take you over to 26 and 6. And if you can help us clean up by finding any cups, any plates, stickers, any of the doodads and doohickeys around you. We have to turn this place over pretty quick. So thank you for coming out. Thank you, panel. Thank you, speakers. I forgot to do some call to actions, too.
Oh, you did. But I want to say, let's have a big thank you for Noel, who...
I am a part of it. Thank you, but I am part of a team, and the thank you team. Thank you, Mayor's Office of Tech and Innovation, and Adrian and Genevieve for helping put together our mutual inaugural Open Data Week, and thank you all Open Data Week partners who are going to be kicking off. So things that you can do that I think should be said is, one, the city's still running big apps, which started off as an apps competition to use open data, and it's now being put in place to serve real problems that the city has. There's an event this Tuesday at Civic Hall, which is on 20. They moved to, what is it? 20. Where did they move to? 22nd Street. 118 West 22nd Street, which is over here on 22nd Street and 6th Avenue. In the evening, Tuesday is actually the anniversary, the actual anniversary of the city's open data law. Department of City Planning is going to, if you didn't have a chance to, Chris, wave your hand. If you didn't have a chance to to go into their workshop, they're going to be demoing their tool. The city is also going to be demoing the new front end to the city's open data portal. There's going to be a lot of mentors that are there. So if you're thinking about solving real problems and using technology data design to address those problems, put on your hat Tuesday night, and then another partner that you should take a look at. If you have a more advanced program, you should take a look at Blue Ridge Labs. They currently have a call for fellows, and they have it's kind of Techstars, but for social good. And so they have a whole, I think it's like 6 or 8 months incubator process. They've worked with a number of community partners to look at real problems that affect people in poverty, and think about how technology data design could essentially improve all of our lives. So that is Blue Ridge Labs. And then the third thing is DataKind. Our friends at DataKind are hosting a Data Jam Hackathon at the 92nd Street Y. They're running tomorrow. Their event is also running today and tomorrow. So if you want to make this a whole weekend, go to open-data.nyc and figure out how to plug into our friends at DataKind, their event tomorrow. So with that, thank you very much. We will see you throughout the year at our events and through all of the beautiful community spaces, hopefully at another event here at Rise. If not, we'll see you 1 year from now, hopefully here at NYC School of Data. So thank you.